After beginning today's discussion with a much broader topic, we thought we'd spend the rest of the day zeroing in on three more specific issues as case studies or more narrower examples of the government's power to grant and deny permits and licenses and approval. And so for our second panel today, we thought we would focus on the energy industry and current discussions and debates over the government's power to grant or deny approvals over energy infrastructure. And of course, that can cover everything from pipelines to power lines and so on. But no matter what aspect of the energy industry you want to talk about, there's no better scholar in American law today to hear on these subjects than James Coleman, who, as his Twitter handle indicates, energy law prof. He covers it all. And so we're very pleased to have James and Nathan and Travis all to speak on today's subject. We're going to go in the order of first James, and then Nathan, and then Travis. I'll introduce each of the speakers as it's their turn to speak. So we'll begin with James. Professor James Coleman is an assistant professor at Southern Methodist University's Dedman School of Law, where he writes and teaches on energy regulation, oil and gas law, international oil markets, and energy trade and transport. Before coming to SMU, he taught at the University of Calgary's law and business schools. He practiced law in Washington at Sidley Austin, and he clerked for Judge Steve Colleton of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Eighth Circuit. We thank Professor Coleman for writing such an interesting and informative paper for this conference on issues in energy infrastructure regulation. And as I mentioned earlier, like all of our papers, it's available on our website, and I highly recommend it. So James, why don't you begin?
All right. Well, thanks so much, Adam. It's wonderful to be here today. I'll be talking about pipelines and power lines. And I'm going to introduce the paper very briefly. I'm going to just say three things. So first, why we need more pipelines and power lines. Second, why it's getting harder to build these projects. And third, what laws and regulations we might be able to change to get some of these projects built. So the first thing it's helpful to understand is that all energy sources have upsides and downsides, but you can sort of think of most of our energy sources on a rough continuum from dirty to clean. So on our dirty side, we have coal and oil. Don't burn those in your house. You get a little bit cleaner, or actually substantially cleaner with natural gas. Fine to burn in the house, very few air emissions, but there's still some carbon emissions. And then at the very clean side, we would have all those alternative sources of energy, nuclear power, solar and wind power, etc. So unfortunately, that same dirty to clean spectrum is also the spectrum from easy to transport to difficult to transport. The modern world was built on two commodities, coal for electricity and oil for transport. And that's because those commodities are easy to move wherever you need to burn them. So you can send them by rail, ship, or truck. And with oil pipelines, you also have the the opportunity to move it by pipeline as well. It's actually so cheap to move oil that we often think about a single world oil price because we have all these pipelines. This is a map from Time magazine in 1964, and you can see all these pipelines around the United States. Whether you move oil by pipeline, by rail, or by truck, we can talk about a single world price for oil roughly, because if oil gets more expensive anywhere, you just ship them some more oil until the prices roughly equalize. Now, gas and power, our cleaner energy sources, are not at all the same. They are much more expensive to transport. So with gas, you're going to need either a multi-billion-dollar airtight pipeline to transport it where you need it, or you're going to need a multi-billion-dollar liquefaction facility that's going to take that natural gas, bring it most of the way down to absolute zero until it becomes a liquid, and then load it on a $250 million tanker to take it overseas so it can be turned back into gas and burned where it's needed. Obviously, a very expensive process. And with wind or solar power, it's even worse. You only have one option, which is that you move things by a multi-billion-dollar power line, rather. So just to give you a sense of that kind of problem, if you look at where wind power resources, for instance, are in the United States, they are strongest here on this map in this purple region, basically from North Dakota down to the panhandle of Texas, right? Now, now I'm in Dallas. I grew up in Minnesota. I have done this drive through that region several times. I can tell you, no one lives there. Well, apologies, but few people live there. And so as a result, if you wanted to use all that wind power that's available there, and several economic studies would say that at least on average, wind power is the cheapest source of energy in that for new production in that region. Doesn't mean it's the most valuable because you can't get it necessarily when you need it, but it's the cheapest source on average per kilowatt hour. If you wanted to use that, you'd have to connect it to markets. And so there are multi-billion-dollar proposed power lines. Several have been proposed. They haven't yet been built, and we'll talk about some of the challenges to actually building those power lines. So the good news that I have for you is that on energy in the United States is that the United States is dramatically ramping up production of energy. Mostly oil. Right now, you all have read books about oil booms. You all have seen movies about oil booms. There has never been an oil boom. I can go over the math with you if you want, but there's never been an oil boom in the history of the world as big as the one that's currently happening in Texas. But we're also ramping up almost as dramatically our production of solar and wind power as well as natural gas. The bad news is that we're struggling to build energy transport to bring those energy sources to the consumers that want to use it. So we're wasting more and more natural gas, more and more wind power because we haven't built the pipelines and power lines that we need to bring it to market. And even oil prices are taking a hit in parts of the country because we don't have enough oil pipelines to bring it to market. So I'm going to focus today on two problems among the problems that I identify in the paper for building these new pipelines and power lines because our legal system is making them harder to build. So first, let me focus on the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA. NEPA, if you need a federal permit, that may be because you're building a natural gas pipeline. Interstate natural gas pipelines are regulated by the federal government, or you're building a pipeline or power line that crosses an international border, or you're crossing too much federal land, then you're going to need the federal government to do an environmental review under the National Environmental Policy Act. Those environmental reviews take far too long. For the last 20 years, presidents from different political parties have tried to streamline and speed those National Environmental Policy Act reviews, but it hasn't worked. So, in 2008, National Environmental Policy Act reviews took 3.4 years, but they were getting longer. By 2015, it was over 4 years. The most recent study that was done looked at environmental reviews that were completed in 2016 and said on average those take more than 5 years. So if you wanted a federal permit today and it required an environmental review, how long would it take based on the pace of how quickly these reviews are getting longer? Probably you're going to count on 6 or 7 years. Now, even a very patient company typically wants to make its investment back in a decade or two. And that's going to be very hard to do if the environmental review takes up half of the time that you're planning for getting your return on your investment. So why do these NEPA reviews take so long? Well, this is something I'd love to discuss with the panel or with the audience, but I think the fundamental reason is that the courts keep asking the federal agencies to do more on these environmental reviews, and the agencies in response kind of gild the lily on these environmental reviews. They get lengthier and lengthier. By the way, one thing you might think about with that problem is that more than half of the NEPA decisions, more than half of the NEPA cases are filed in the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. So second, another problem I'll mention is that states are trying to block energy resources that they don't like. For example, interstate natural gas pipelines are approved by the federal government, but New York has started blocking pipelines approved by the federal government using power that they have delegated under the Clean Water Act. As a result, we have some of the cheapest natural gas in the world is in western Pennsylvania, where the shale revolution has really increased production. But just last year, during the winter, the most expensive natural gas in the world was just a couple hundred miles down I-90 in Boston. So we are having U.S. consumers suffering from lack of natural gas, whereas we have a glut of natural gas and producers that can't find markets for it just a couple miles away because we have states blocking some of these resources. Power lines are even easier to block than natural gas pipelines because they need state-by-state approval. So we've had the example of Arkansas blocking Tennessee from getting wind power that it wanted from Oklahoma. Or we have New Hampshire blocking Massachusetts from getting hydropower that it wanted from Canada. So those are two of the problems. Now, what can we do to actually build the projects that we need? Well, let me preview just two of the suggestions that I offer in the paper, and I'd love to talk about these as well. So first, at some point, environmental reviews under the National Environmental Policy Act should end. So NEPA it's not a substantive statute. It doesn't say disapprove things that aren't a good environmental idea. It's just supposed to be a look before you leap procedural statute that says the government took a look at the environmental consequences before it approved a project. Unfortunately, courts, especially the Ninth Circuit, they're routinely looking at these government decisions that have had more than a decade of review or almost a decade of review and saying, no, go back, do some more review of this project. So one of my proposals is that NEPA should not be enforceable in the courts after 6 years of environmental review. So, the government after 6 years, it should be enforceable up to that time, but after 6 years, it shouldn't be enforceable. Government would still have an incentive to do prompt review so that the project could be started earlier. You could get it started in 2 years or 3 years. But if the government has been reviewing something for 6 years, I don't think that NEPA requirement should be enforceable anymore. Now you might say, wow, 6 years is too long, it should be much shorter than that. Well, I agree. However, there are complex projects, and also from the perspective of the company, you're not as much worried about something getting delayed 4 or 5 years. What your concern is, this is never, ever going to end. I'm going to be one of these 6-year, 7-year, 10-year projects. And by cutting it off, hard cap at 6 years, that at least gives you some certainty that if the government still wants to go forward with your project after 6 years of review, you will be able to go ahead. Second, there should be a stronger federal backstop that prevents states from blocking important interstate energy transport projects. So states shouldn't be able to block federally approved natural gas pipelines, and the federal government should have wider authority to step in and make sure that crucial power lines are built. And with that, I'll look forward to our discussion.
Thanks, James. Okay. Our second speaker is Professor Nathan Richardson. He's an associate professor at the University of South Carolina School of Law and a visiting fellow at a major Washington think tank, Resources for the Future. He teaches and writes broadly on energy and environmental issues, including federal climate policy, state and local oil and gas regulation, the evolution of our power sector, and forest management. Now, for several years before Nathan joined USC, his policy analyses on energy and environmental regulation were invaluable, the stuff he was writing at RFF. And now in legal academia, he's become one of the most interesting environmental law scholars in the country, so we're very lucky to have him today. Nathan.
Thanks so much, Adam, for that generous introduction. But I guess it's my pleasure today to follow James, who really is one of the leading scholars on this specific topic, on energy infrastructure. I hope someday some president can convince him to leave the best job in the country and go be a FERC commissioner or something, because we need people as sharp as he is thinking about this stuff. Every time somebody asks me about pipeline approvals, I say go read James' stuff. Every time I think about writing it, I find he's already done it. So it's great to follow him. These are critical problems. James' diagnosis of a problem here has got to be correct. It's getting harder to build what he calls In a word I learned from him, linear infrastructure, energy infrastructure. It's old. The reasons are, to put a different spin on the way that James describes it, it's old tools deployed in new contexts. Some of them very old, eminent domain being redeployed by landowners to try to block some of these projects. I won't talk much about eminent domain, but I think the argument that it can be used to stop a critical public project like this is it's a misuse of the project or of that legal doctrine. And I think, and that doesn't necessarily, like, you can have all kinds of objections to what happened in Kilo and still think the eminent domain is completely the wrong tool to block linear infrastructure. That seems at the core of the government's ability to use that power and the justification for it. But that's an old tool. Things like turf battles between, federalism is great, but like one of the downsides of federalism is you get these turf battles. I think Travis will talk more about that. But James gives an example of states intervening in what typically was the federal domain, traditionally was the federal domain of natural gas pipeline approvals. And then particularly you have particularly within the environmental movement, you have a huge and it seems like still growing salience of pipelines as an environmental issue. Not that they're not, I'm not suggesting that they're not a huge environmental issue, but it seems a little bit outsized. It seems to be that a lot of the focus on the climate problem and a variety of local environmental problems really comes to a head in pipelines. Talking to leaders in the environmental movement, sometimes they don't have an explanation for this. This is just part of being a public interest movement is that you ride the bronco of public opinion a little bit, and to some extent that seems to have gotten ahead of the movement here. But nevertheless, that energy is where it is, and the environmental movement's going to harness it. That results in using, again, old tools, NEPA most of all, but other procedural barriers as well to try to block these projects. I think a charitable interpretation on that is that NEPA is, in many contexts, the only tool that's available, that there may be inadequate environmental law or just inadequate venues for voices to be heard. So NEPA and the courts become the venue of choice because it's the only place where certain arguments can be held. Nevertheless, that doesn't mean that things are working efficiently. It should not take 5 years to do a decent environmental analysis. They're hard, they're difficult, but it shouldn't take that long. These are tools, if you look at the foundational NEPA cases, they're all about nuclear power plants, and this is the same game being played again. It's venue shopping. But often that venue shopping, while we might criticize it, it's if you squeeze the balloon on NEPA, that's going to come out somewhere else too. There's also a bit of Baptist and bootleggers here. Of course, to some extent, the right, and I'm going to glibly refer to the right and the left here, but both of them contain multitudes. But there's some Baptists and bootleggers. I mentioned the eminent domain folks and the landowners and the pipeline opponents. I think it's worth remembering. Often you talk about Baptists and bootleggers, and people mean it as like a euphemism for bipartisanship. It's not. It's Baptists and bootleggers against someone else, and that someone else is the public. And I think that's worth remembering here. So a lot of times you see the odd bedfellow stuff is like nice and fun for us to like think about and talk about, those of us that like care about these issues, but ultimately there's a loser here, and it's often the public. This seems to be getting worse. It's hard to deal with. The 2005 Energy Policy Act tried to make approval of interstate transmission lines a lot more streamlined. It didn't work. It like rapidly got torn apart in the courts. And it's really bad. This impedes, as James has pointed out, environmental and economic goals. So there should be a grand bargain here, something along the lines of correct the current situation where there's all these negative spillovers. You like develop some tactics to oppose a pipeline, and then those get redeployed to oppose a transmission line that you think is a good idea. There's no way to confine them. Some way to reduce these barriers, as James has suggested. Broadly speaking, the Greens get their transmission lines, and the right, or maybe the broader economy, gets these gas pipelines. Oil pipelines may come along for the ride too, not so much because they're super clean, as James pointed out, but because if you don't have them, the alternative is worse, the rail transport and the truck transport. Don't get me started on whether these tools should be used to approve rail lines that allow for coal exports. You're going to fracture the coalition if we do that. So let's just not talk about it today. And I think that grand bargain gets you to a point where everybody except like the true keep it in the ground folks are happy with where you get. I'm not one of those keep it in the ground folks. I never have been. When I read the IPCC report last week, I stopped and thought for a minute, maybe they're right. I don't know, maybe I may change my view. But when you think about what happens in Boston, as James describes it, that makes no sense. And the end result environmentally is you burn more coal and oil in New England, and that can't be right. So if your way to keep it in the ground is to like not build any more gas pipelines, you got to be willing to tolerate a lot of perverse outcomes, and I'm not willing to do that. In short, I think most of James' recommendations should be quickly accepted. We should have this grand bargain. I have some reservations. I think NEPA should be reformed. I think that's really hard. I don't like the idea of putting a hard timeline on NEPA reviews. I know it's intellectually appealing, but my worry is that if you put a hard timeline on, an administration that just wants to get the approval through will just like run out the clock and then get to a point where there's no review, no judicial review, or even a company that's like got a bad project, they'll delay the process themselves until a point where there can't be any challenges anymore. So just a hard clock doesn't work. I don't have a better suggestion there than just having the clock run out, but some more specificity in the statute about what kind of issues are in play. Having a council of environmental advisors that's supposed to do oversight of NEPA, having them give clear guidance. They've tried to do that for years. That itself has been caught up in litigation and political fights, so it's not easy there. There are problems on the other side of NEPA too, so there may be another grand bargain here. There are probably way too many categorical exclusions in NEPA. There's a lot of projects that should get reviewed but don't because they're under categorical exclusions. So if we really were able to all sit at a table and reform NEPA, I think there are opportunities for both sides to get something they want and have a better statute here. Unfortunately, I'm skeptical that that will happen or that what the other reforms that James has suggested will happen. There's very little trust now in the political system, as all of us know, but I think that's particularly true in energy and environmental issues. I hope that changes. Pipelines are highly, highly salient, so it's really, really difficult to come up with a compromise here that says, oh, we're going to like let pipelines go through and get this other stuff. It makes sense, but it's hard to sell. We're going to allow these high-profile pipelines to go through in exchange for some marginal but really important wider reductions on emissions. Just hard to do that. Some of the things, you can blame the left for that if you want, and like not controlling their own folks and letting this become a big issue. I don't think that's totally fair. To some extent, they can't do that. There has been some behavior by pipeline companies that I think jeopardizes their own social license to operate. Even if you get, moreover, a bargain here, it's possible that it gets litigated and torn up quickly with the 2005 Energy Policy Act, an illustration of that. Let me just make two more quick points, and they're big ones, but all I can do is leave them on the table given the amount of time I have left. One is that a revisionist take on James's point is that maybe he pulls a punch a little bit, and what we should really do is federalize all of these approvals. I know that's not a very federalist thing to say, but it's like no one would design the system that we have now with like mixed approval for transmission, state leadership on oil pipelines, and federal leadership on gas pipelines. It makes no sense. If there's anything the federal government should do, it should seem to be these kind of trade-offs between states, avoid free rider and holdout problems. Everybody benefits if we're able to do this efficiently, assuming the federal government could do it, but at least get rid of some of these parochial interests. I know that's even more politically difficult than what's already been suggested, but if you did it from first principles, that might be what you do. I also want to footnote that the problems James identified are part of a bigger problem that go beyond linear infrastructure. It's really hard to build stuff in America. The smartest people I know that think about this, people from, broadly speaking, on the right in this building, Tyler Cowen, to people on the left like Matt Iglesias that care about it, public intellectuals, they don't know. They have their own kind of theories for why this might be true, but the smartest people I know thinking about this are upfront about the fact that we don't know exactly why. Part of it has got to be environmental approvals and overregulation. Part of it's economics, is Baumol's cost disease. Part of it is, I don't know. I take notice when some of the smartest people I know throw up their hands and say, this is an interesting problem. We don't know why this is true. And it seems to be particularly true in the United States. It's hard in other developed countries as well, but there's something about the United States in particular that makes this hard. It's very expensive and very difficult. And that's whether you're talking about an apartment building in San Francisco, a subway line in New York, or this kind of linear energy infrastructure. And I think this conversation needs to be part of that broader one. My hope would be that would further help unlock more of these grand bargains, even if I remain politically somewhat skeptical.
Thank you very much, Nathan. Well, following Nathan's suggestion that maybe the state should just get out of this altogether, it's my pleasure to welcome the Vice Chairman of the Montana Public Service Commission.
Token parochialist.
The Honorable Travis KAVULLA. He's the Vice Chairman of the Montana Public Service Commission. He was elected to that body by Montana's largest geographic district. The Montana PSC generally regulates private investor-owned natural gas, electric, telephone, water, private sewer companies, as well as many motor carriers. If I'm correct, you have jurisdiction over some garbage trucks, right?
Yes.
You cover everything. And the PSC also oversees rail and pipeline safety. In addition to his work on the PSC, Travis has served as president of the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners, also known as NARUC. He also co-chairs the Northern Tier Transmission Group Steering Committee, which does regional power infrastructure planning for much of the Pacific Northwest. And he co-chairs the Committee on Regional Electric Power Cooperation, which leads Western states' discussions on energy policy and power grid reliability. You sound very busy, and so thank you very much for joining us today.
Well, thank you so much, Adam, and I really appreciate the invite, and I appreciate James's paper and Nathan giving me a great jumping-off point for my discussion today. Hopefully, I'll convince you that I'm not a mere parochialist, and that there is a role for some cooperative federalism, as well as possibly federalizing and streamlining some of these processes. Electric infrastructure siting is parochial because of its historical genesis. Originally, electric utilities were very parochial. They were not interconnected between one another. They tended to rely on local sources of power generation, powering particular cities. They started not even as Commonwealth Edison, Illinois. They started as power companies serving single cities or single counties. And by, they consolidated. Even when they didn't commercially merge, they interconnected with one another, and this led to the transshipment across state lines of electrical power, most notably and legally implicating was an attempt by the state of Rhode Island's Utility Commission to regulate the price of power sold across the border to Massachusetts to the city of Attleboro's utility company, which led to a memorable Supreme Court case and something called the Attleboro Gap, where the Supreme Court invalidated the state's attempt to regulate that sale and essentially left, someone used the word lacuna earlier today, it left a lacuna in the law, the Supreme Court inviting Congress to fill that gap, and it did so, but only minimally, creating the Federal Power Commission, which regulated the interstate sale of electricity, and it's been built up from there. Electricity now is highly networked in the United States. There are 3 separate interconnections in the United States: the Western interconnection, the Eastern interconnection, and Texas. Texas has its own, which is not regulated by FERC, fun fact, but by the state's Public Utility Commission. But now, if you look to the Western United States, there are 59 owners of the transmission grid in the Western United States. All of them are interconnected seamlessly with one another, with the exception of a few power lines that operate on a direct current basis. The rest of them are interconnected on 60 hertz alternating current, and when you add a new transmission line to the system, it doesn't just work to effectuate point-to-point transfers, my wind farm to your local utility. It's sort of like doing a cannonball into the pool. It has a cascading effect across all of the system. Electricity moves very fast and in unpredictable ways, and when you have a commercial designation of an electron in the state of Washington, meaning to go to California, as in a practical matter, it often ends up in Colorado due to the nature of the physics on the electric grid. So the commercial and the physical reality isn't aligned, and unlike the other industries that James talks about, oil and gas, where operators of those transmission systems can actually intervene and intercede to make sure the physical commodity is flowing along a particular path or limited in some way in its flow, that simply isn't the case any longer in electricity. So you have the ironic situation where the most physically interconnected transnational interstate infrastructure, electricity, is also the most subject to local regulation, to state regulation. As opposed to, say, telecommunications, which once started off largely in the hands of state utility commissions and now has been largely federalized. I still do some things, as Adam alluded to, over telecommunications. We recently had a rulemaking about whether telephone books should be required to be distributed to consumers by local telephone companies. Occasionally you sit on these regulatory commissions and ask yourself, why am I here? Why am I hearing this petition? But the point serves that states really do control the regulation of electric operating companies in a way that they do not other things that have essentially been nationalized. As James points out, the interconnectedness of this network is only going to get more profound. Intermittent sources of renewables require more interconnection because regions have to, individual utility operating companies have to net out the intermittencies that are created by weather-dependent renewables. They have to rely on one another for when the wind is blowing in Montana, but the sun is not shining in California, or for spare capacity of an idling natural gas plant that isn't needed by a local utility operating company in one place where the wind is blowing strong, but is necessary in another place. So you're heading toward a more and more and more interconnected interstate network, at least by its physical properties. It's as if we're heading toward a broadband world where we expect a commodity, data or electricity, to flow efficiently, but where a significant measure of how that data is transmitted is regulated by, say, the state of California. It's a net neutrality joke, Tom. So it's a fair question to ask whether this regime of not so cooperative federalism that James describes in his paper can or should survive. States have to take some of the blame upon themselves because they're trying to do kind of two opposite things in their analysis in transmission siting regulation, and I'll mainly focus on electric transmission. And both of them, one of them involves a parochial lens. First, states are considering only those benefits that accrue locally from interstate electric transmission siting. Electric transmission, when it's sited and permitted, obtains a right to eminent domain almost everywhere, as far as I understand. And traditionally, state regulators apply a public convenience and necessity test for that handoff of the state's eminent domain power, which traditionally requires an inference that a project is needed. Well, needed by whom? If it's needed to bring Oklahoma-produced wind to Tennessee through Arkansas, is it needed by Arkansas such that the state of Arkansas should lend its sovereign power of eminent domain to the private developer of a transmission line? States have struggled with that question, including my own. The Montana-Alberta tie line is a good example of this. It's a merchant transmission line whose only customer was a Montana wind farm under contract to a Southern California utility for its environmental attributes, but most of whose transmission flowed northward to Alberta. It tried and did obtain a permit and siting for the line from the local regulator. And when it went to take land for the property, there was an unwilling landowner in this case. It used eminent domain, and the landowner who objected to the siting of the line near historic teepee rings on her private property brought the case to court, or protested in court, that this merchant transmission line was not a public utility in the meaning of the state's law in the first place. A judge agreed, invalidating the project's use of eminent domain, and it was only when the state legislature intervened in 2011, passing legislation that essentially, not special legislation, but the type of legislation you write when there's a major cluster like this, pass a piece of legislation conferring eminent domain powers on a project of this type. Missouri has had similar legislation with its PSC going back and forth and granting and denying permits for a similar design transmission line. And as James notes in his article, the project in question, Clean Line, had to be literally saved by having it designated as a project owned or sponsored by a federal agency, in this case one of the 4 power marketing administrations that exist as semi-autonomous entities and utilities in their own right within the Department of Energy, although the Trump administration has now withdrawn that designation following intense lobbying by the Arkansas congressional delegation. Meanwhile, other states, especially in the Midwest, have passed state right of first refusal laws, giving the incumbent utility an option on any electric transmission development. And the real consequence of this is to typically block more innovative interstate transmission projects. Why would they risk the development capital if the local monopoly can just slurp up their project that they've invested risk capital in? At the same time that state regulators are only considering local benefits and not a wider scope, they're also doing sort of the opposite on the cost side. They're thinking globally and acting locally in their permitting and siting processes. So per James's paper, New Hampshire recently denied a piece of electric infrastructure that would connect Quebec hydropower to New England. Massachusetts was the off-taker specifically, and in its finding, it relied on damage to fisheries in Quebec when a new dam impoundment was built. So similarly, Washington State's evaluation, we promised, well, Nathan said we shouldn't bring up coal, but I'm going to do it anyways. Washington State's evaluation of a coal export terminal that would send low sulfur coal from the Powder River Basin in Montana and Wyoming to markets in Asia. Cowlitz County, as well as the state's Department of Ecology, conducted really a mind-blowingly expansive consequent emissions analysis about the global emissions effect of burning this coal, essentially purporting that Cowlitz County should be the world's carbon regulator for a piece of infrastructure like this. Bizarre. So it's awkward. Do we really expect state regulators to consider only local benefits and local costs, or do we expect them to look systemically? I guess my view, which I would hope would find more statutory expression or perhaps just regulatory acceptance within institutions like PUCs, is that if there's some other entity that's more directly charged with ordering mitigation to costs in question that are non-local, let them, as a matter of deference or abstention or whatever, deal with that question. But I think the interplay between a state's conferral of its eminent domain powers to a corporation that might bring few benefits to its citizens is a less tractable problem. A few more things. First, local, and I have to say this since I'm from a state, that local regulation isn't all bad, and I just want to give a couple of examples of that. Keystone, the Keystone XL pipeline is a good one. In Montana's licensing of that facility, we insisted on an on-ramp for the Bakken oil production in eastern Montana and western North Dakota as a condition of the license. Here's a pipeline that represented itself as a common carrier in order to obtain the state's conferral of its eminent domain powers upon the pipeline. But in this first practical iteration, the pipeline offered no practical way for other people's production, other than Canadian production, to be carried on it. And here I think it's reasonable that a state uses its authority to effectuate meaningful access to this public use infrastructure. Again, I'm not, if it wasn't an eminent domain project, I don't think you'd have to do that. But if these linear pieces of infrastructure expect to use eminent domain, and they all do, then it's reasonable to make that trade-off. If it had been nationally cited, it's easy for me to conceive that that might have not been a priority for the national regulator, who may have seen the public interest as vested on the U.S. side of the border from the lens of consumers or the refineries in Texas or wherever was a place of political consequence, and not the producers in Montana and North Dakota who you can reliably count to vote in certain ways and, just kind of take them for granted. So are there ways to distinguish when a state imposes reasonable versus unreasonable conditions? I don't know, but I leave that out there. On electric transmission in particular, I really do have to push back against James's suggestion that there should be a single national regulator, and that's because of the intersection of transmission line development with cost of service regulation of this industry, where every dollar a developer spends will ultimately go into a rate charged to a captive set of consumers. And this is really quite distinct from pipelines, where need is demonstrated through willing financial counterparties who subscribe to capacity. The consideration of whether an electric transmission project is needed and therefore permitted is different than for a pipeline. If you're a pipeline, show me your shipper subscriptions as a prima facie demonstration of need, and I should give you a license, supposing that your route is environmentally sound. Ultimately, it's the pipeline developer and the subscribers who are pledging risk capital to that. That's not the case for most electric transmission. There is no willing financial counterparty, only a regulated utility, often vertically integrated. And in such an arrangement, if you nationalize siting and economic regulation, you're creating a kind of regulator who both certifies and cites transmission lines, even while largely guaranteeing their commercial success through economic regulation. So here it seems reasonable to have a state authority stand in for consumers as being closer to a proxy for the willing financial counterparty. There have been good examples where some of this big transmission has been built. MISO's transmission build-out is a good example of that, and I'll save maybe that for questions. I do think rather than having an overarching rule, as James suggests, there might be certain situations, the federal government acting as a tiebreaker, where one state authorizes a utility to enter into a power purchase agreement that relies on an interstate transmission line, but another where its situs at, the regulator denies it. Maybe there you get the federal government involved, perhaps several other areas. Finally, and I apologize for taking so long, Adam, the feds really, I mean, it must be said, and I'm sure everyone realizes, but the feds have to put their own house in order. Federal permitting is much longer in duration typically than state processes, and the national government really cannot be said to be a particularly lucid arbiter of the national interest, certainly not a timely one. It is also the case that the federal government is in itself kind of a hydra and not a single decision maker. Hydroelectric licensing is a good example of this, where every agency wants a piece of the action, from Commerce's National Marine Fisheries Service to Agriculture's Forest Service to Interior's Fish and Wildlife Service, each of them hanging Christmas ornaments on the tree of what should be a single process under FERC. And finally, I promised in the social media coverage of this panel to make a joke about the mating habits of sage grouse. And I promise there's a nexus here. And my point here is to prove that there's really very little expectation of consistency even within a single federal government agency. And I go to my friends at the Bureau of Land Management, which is the largest sort of trustee of the largest landowner in the state of Montana. And here, this is just my favorite. The BLM, under NEPA and another law, the Federal Land Policy and Management Act of 1976, issued 2 resource management plans roughly simultaneously, within 50 days of one another, for 2 different field offices in the state of Montana. There's a lot of gas and oil on BLM, so these plans really are meaningful in how you produce and collect and gather and distribute oil. One of the field offices is located in the central north of the state, one in the southeast, and each considered how wide of a berth from oil and gas activity the native sage grouse required for its mating habitat. One RMP concluded 1 mile, the other 2 miles, using the same academic papers about the mating habits of sage grouse in the same state. Are the mating habits, are one sage grouse just more licentious than the other? According to the BLM, the answer is yes. But clearly, you cannot depend on national agencies to make necessarily streamlined or non-arbitrary distinctions.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you, Travis. Well, Travis had an opportunity to sort of reply a bit to what's already been said. James and Nathan, if you want to reply, any thoughts on animal mating habits or anything else that's been discussed today, feel free. James?
Well, I'm a 3 miles person.
Okay.
That's been my considered view, and I will not budge. So yeah, thank you so much. These are incredibly helpful comments. So let me just focus on a couple that might be helpful. So first, and this is sort of an overall point on which Nathan is undoubtedly correct, which is that there are many reasons why it now takes longer to build projects, and this is a deep economic puzzle that has engaged any number of academics across disciplines, across political persuasions, etc. So let me just explain my personal view of how I approach those. It's sort of like if you're getting water in a corner of your house. You have 4 different people look at that problem. They all have a different theory. It's coming in around the windows. Your gutters are clogged. There's some problem on your roof. It's in the shared wall with the neighbor, etc. So how do you, unfortunately, what I see from many people often with the problem of lengthening permit delays, and equivalently it would be there's polarization, there's disagreement between federal and state government, there's Baumol's cost disease, etc. That's effectively saying, what I hear a lot of times from academics is, well, I don't think we're going to solve it. And my concern about that is that's pretty much saying, like, let's just live with water in the house, right? And my experience in practice with those kind of circumstances is usually what you have to do is try to fix all of them. And you're never going to get a perfect causal breakdown of what happens, but when you fix all of those problems, eventually the water stops, right? And I think that's the approach that we need to be taking. And so I'm very willing to concede that NEPA is only one of the problems, but I think to have any kind of solution to this problem, you need to try to address them all simultaneously, and it's undoubtedly a problem, as we all agree. In terms of the concerns about cutting it off, the concern that government will run out the clock, The only thing I would say is that if after 6 years, at any time, the government can deny a project. If 6 years, that takes us through 2 administrations, that takes us through 3 Congresses. If we've decided we're going to go forward with this project regardless, I'm not too concerned, that if there's some technical deficiency with the review, or that the government, I'm not sure why the private party who just wants to build its project should be punished for the fact that a government can't complete an adequate review in 6 years. If the company itself is delaying the process in any way, obviously that should not, if the company hasn't given a complete application or hasn't responded to information requests, obviously that would be a reason to extend it beyond the 6 years, and I would acknowledge that. The only thing I wanted to say in response to Travis's remarks, also extremely helpful. I think one way to think about this problem is I might think of it is kind of the 3-state problem, which is that if, historically a lot of power transmission was 2 ways, is the cannonball in the pool. And there's benefits to both states because they're both going to have local, surpluses or at different time, et cetera. Oil and gas transport, by contrast, a lot of the original oil transport was built to avoid German submarines along the coast. It was a real national necessity, but it's taking oil, as we saw on that graph, from Texas and Oklahoma all the way up to the East Coast. So you have to cross several states to get it there, and the main benefit is to producers in the oil patch and consumers that are, far distant. Once you start crossing states in the middle, you run into a problem where the benefits, they don't have that many producers, they don't have that many consumers, and effectively they are helping out the national economy. And I think once you have that 3-state thing, which we're starting to have with electricity, because of these resources that are only concentrated in one part of the country, and we need to get those resources to places where consumers can benefit from having cleaner wind power, et cetera, I think that creates a need for some kind of federal backstop. I love the debate between sort of federal and state policy, and I think there's excellent points on both sides. I think, constructing that backstop so it takes account of both of those arguments, I think, is difficult, but a very important task for dealing with the increasingly integrated nature of energy markets in the country.
Nathan, anything else?
I'm tempted to suggest, in response, James, the reverse rule. So we have a time limit on NEPA, but if after 5 years we haven't completed review, the project is denied, which of course then presents the opposite problems. Like you worry environmentalists will run out the clock. To some extent, that's what they already do.
Right.
They're hoping the company gives up. So which tempts me to suggest, and even, you're going to throw me off the stage after this. After 5 years, just flip a coin. I mean, at that point, we don't know. Like we've had a bunch of paperwork. Like we don't know if this is a good idea or not. So we should just randomly allocate it.
Draw a lot. Maybe we could draw lots for which projects are built.
Yeah,
That way,
exactly.
So some
Yeah.
get built at least. Yeah,
Something
exactly.
like that.
The Greek approach, to energy infrastructure. That's good.
On that last suggestion, Adrian Vermeule actually did an entire paper focusing largely on NEPA called Rationally Arbitrary Decision-Making, saying especially NEPA epitomizes the area of law where you're going to have to make a decision under uncertainty, and on one level it's just going to be arbitrary what you do. This conversation brought back a lot of memories for me because my first stretch of my legal career was in energy infrastructure, especially NEPA. Just some of the things that you threw out, James, right there, the idea of have a deadline but have it triggered to the submission of a complete application. We used to litigate cases all the time under a similar statute, the Coastal Zone Management Act, over whether our application was complete. We would litigate for years over that. Similarly, you can set a deadline on government review, but what happens if you get to the end of the deadline? We saw this a bit with Keystone. The decision maker can always just say, well, we're going to deny your application unless you waive the deadline. In fact, I think that's what happened with Keystone, or something similar to it.
Yes,
No?
so Keystone, Keystone is wonderful because I love Travis's example of how Montana used its local regulatory authority to ensure that it provided benefits to Montanans. That is wonderful. It was in 2008 that was proposed. It is now 2018, soon to be 2019, and that permit is still in district court in the Ninth Circuit in Montana, and they keep asking for more review. So it's already been 10 years of review, but we still need some more. Now, how valuable are those reviews? Well, there was, under President Obama, they did 7 years of review, and President Obama said, he did it in a speech at Georgetown, he says, we will deny this pipeline if it increases greenhouse gas emissions in Canada. In other words, if it leads to increased oil production in Canada. So they did 7 years of review. The State Department came back and said it will actually lower greenhouse gas emissions because it means that people will send oil by pipeline instead of by rail, which causes more greenhouse gas emissions. So you might think, oh, so President Obama approved the pipeline. Well, I think you all know the spoiler on that one. And in fact, what President Obama said when he denied the pipeline, after 7 years of review that said it would reduce greenhouse gas emissions, is that despite our review, and this is really in the document, it will be perceived as increasing greenhouse gas emissions. So that gives you a sense of how valuable those 7 years of review were. We ultimately decided that it was better to go with public perception in our official record of decision rather than the result of that 7 years of study.
Well, let me ask one question about the nuts and bolts of NEPA, and then we'll open up the floor. I mean, at the end of the day, speaking as somebody who spent years living in an office full of NEPA environmental documents, on the one hand, it's sort of easy to, I often did throw up my hands and say, this is ridiculous. On the other hand, NEPA does pose a fundamental challenge and a good and important one to decision makers, both in government and in the private sector. It's forcing them to, as I called it in one paper, think about the unthinkable, right? Think about what could go wrong, right? Think about what the possible significant environmental impacts of accidents would be, and also think about reasonable alternatives to that project and what the impacts of that would be. Now, of course, at some point this becomes so abstract, it's almost angels dancing on the head of a pin, but at its core, I think it's a really important and useful exercise. And so my question is, how could Congress reform NEPA in a way to preserve the best of that approach while avoiding sort of the never-ending saga? And James, you've offered some examples, but what I would focus on is should Congress reform the duty to review or to analyze possible significant environmental impacts? And should Congress modify the duty to consider alternatives to that project? Those two things, the alternatives analysis and the significant environmental impacts. I'm just curious if any of you have any thoughts on that, not to put you on the spot.
This is hard. NEPA's, I think one way to summarize, I think what you said is that NEPA is or maybe what we've all said, NEPA is a monster, but it is a necessary monster. I think if you don't think NEPA is necessary, like read Cadillac Desert, read what the Bureau of Reclamation did in the last, or read TVA versus Hill. So, this dam is 90% complete. It's going to cause the species to go extinct. Maybe you don't care about the species, but then we do the economic analysis of the dam that's 90% complete, and it's not economically justified to finish the last 10%, ignoring the species entirely. You need something to focus builder agencies or government agencies that are subject to political constraints and political pressures to look at environmental impacts, because they won't do it if you don't. That's Adam's point. Maybe one reform is maybe it was what NEPA does is it then tells those builder agencies to come up with a bunch of paperwork to justify their decision ultimately, and then people outside that oppose the project don't really think that paperwork is credible, so they sue about it, and we have this big fight. Maybe it was a mistake to leave this with the builder agencies all along. Maybe we should have maybe you should have a third-party agency. I don't know if it's EPA, they're not tooled up for this, but have an agency, have a group of experts that reviews environmental projects. You have environmental experts, but you also have economists that are able to look at this kind of stuff. Really, you'd want government to be doing this generally on whether projects are cost-benefit justified, considering environmental impacts, considering all kinds of other externalities. And we're bad at that. ORIRA's supposed to do it for rulemakings. NEPA fulfills some of a similar role. I think some more specificity in the statute would help too. Mm-hmm. A lot of the specificity on what is the scope of a NEPA analysis, or what gets categorical exclusion versus an environmental assessment versus an EIS, that's pushed either over to the builder agency or to CEQ, and some more specificity from Congress on what those guidelines should be would help. What exactly that specificity should be, that's a monstrous political fight that would be very difficult to have. But
On hydroelectric regulation, licensing and relicensing, there was an interesting piece of bipartisan legislation coming out of the Senate Energy Natural Resources by Murkowski and Cantwell. And there, the focus of the legislation was on essentially promoting political accountability. Essentially, if the project was going to be delayed or permitted or denied, or a sort of sister agency to the primary regulator, FERC, wanted more time, or wanted to impose mandatory license conditions that FERC wasn't particularly enthusiastic about, someone at the, I think, assistant secretary level or higher would have to personally authorize the submission of that license requirement. It also contemplated something James called for in his article, which were sort of regional studies that feed into NEPA analyses. So imagine you have 20 hydroelectric facilities in the same basin that will each face similar environmental concerns about a sensitive species or water flow, water temperatures as a result of inflows, outflows. Why not, when we see that the licenses are coming up, why not authorize the government itself to conduct a study so you can study it on a more systemic basin-wide area? And that could be applied to some of the thinking you're now seeing on, say, natural gas permitting at the federal level, where FERC has got itself thinking that maybe it should become a kind of indirect carbon regulator by studying what the carbon emissions effects will be if we bring more natural gas from the Marcellus down toward Florida, which is, frankly, an impossibly complex, almost stupid task to engage in, but it's rendered even more stupid if you try to do it ad hoc by ad hoc pipeline certificate. If this really is going to be the job of FERC, FERC should build some kind of a climate model to allow pipelines to run through the analysis. So I think there's ways of prepping the NEPA process so that it should flow a little more smoothly and demanding political accountability by visible officials at the back end. To that matter, even though I'd love to see Keystone XL finally built, I have to give the president credit for personally and visibly using his authority to deny it, rather than just relegating it to some obscure flunky in the back room who could, pocket veto the thing.
Yeah.
Let me, can I just
Yeah,
say a
real
couple
quick.
things? Because I think the important thing, at least from my perspective, the National Environmental Policy Act, as passed by Congress and signed by the president, is a wonderful thing, right? The National Environmental Policy Act, as interpreted by the Supreme Court, is a wonderful and useful thing. The entire problem is that the lower courts are not doing anything that has to do with the National Environmental Policy Act, the text of the act, or what the Supreme Court has said about it. So if you look at the requirements made by each of these lower courts, the Supreme Court has only taken 17 cases in the 50-year history of NEPA, right? Each of those cases says exactly the same thing. It says the government did plenty. This is a simple statute. The government looked at these consequences, which are important, and it did plenty. Almost all of those cases were unanimous. All but a couple of those cases were unanimous decisions of the U.S. Supreme Court, and most of those decisions specifically said, lower courts, cut it out. Why are you asking so much from the agencies on what is effectively a very simple statute? So when people talk about reform, I think it's crucial to understand the circuit courts aren't doing what the U.S. Supreme Court has said. So if you add a little, a couple, peregrinations to the statute that make it seem like, oh, maybe they should take it a little bit easier on agencies, they're not going to listen to that. They're not listening to the U.S. Supreme Court on that. Instead, I think the only solutions have to do with limiting somewhat the power of the courts to indefinitely stop projects that are approved by a large swath of the government and with careful and lengthy study.
Just an anecdote, and we'll open the floor to questions. But the famous case, the first real famous NEPA case in the D.C. Circuit is called Calvert Cliffs. As Nathan said, it was an NRC case, Nuclear Regulatory Commission case. A couple of years ago, I was chatting with a decade ago, I was chatting with a professor friend of mine, and it dawned on me in the course of the conversation, he was the clerk for Skelly Wright when that opinion came out. And I asked him, I said, were you involved in this case? He said, yeah. He This is a very interesting case. It seemed pretty simple. How did it work out? And at that point, I opened up my briefcase and pulled out 4 volumes of environmental impact statement. I put them on the table, and I said, well, I'm not sure how it is for the country, but it's the Adam White Full Employment Plan, and I'm very grateful. Anyway, we've gone on longer than I planned, but if anybody has any questions, we have a microphone in the room. We have 2 microphones in the room. Tom, you raising your hand? Great. Molly, right here in the front row.
So the federal regulator at the FCC does have shot clocks that imposes now on local governments for cable TV franchising, for so-called 5G infrastructure permitting. That's an ongoing regulatory initiative, and other things. And at the agency itself, they have a shot clock for merger review, et cetera, et cetera. How is this applied in these energy regulations, and how is it working? And is there research showing what impact these shot clocks might have?
Now, the Energy Policy Act tried to put a shot clock on interstate transmission lines, right? Anybody?
Well, there is the shot clock, and I think James refers to it in his paper, of 1 year for Clean Water Act approvals for gas pipelines on the part of the states. And there's been some litigation over whether that deadline was waived or not in a couple of pipelines. For other energy infrastructure, that's not the case. Frankly, for it'll be relatively easy for New York, for example, to execute on their shot clock because their answer for a gas pipeline will be no. So the question, it really almost does default if the project in question truly is implicated by the national interest. How do you deal with recalcitrant states?
Well, yeah, but the argument is that it's good to get a no quickly and then litigate. Well, I mean, the worst. Well, yeah, right. But the worst answer is we'll get back to you.
Right.
As you were pointing out.
The Fourth Circuit case that dealt with the 2005 EPAC statute for interstate transmission, didn't that come down to a case where the shot clock was set that if the states didn't approve it within, I don't know what it was, a year,
Yeah, a year,
then the feds could step in. And I think the state, they didn't approve it, they rejected it.
Yep.
And the court concluded that rejection ended the review altogether, right?
Yes,
Even though the
It
statute
wasn't
was.
a failure to act.
It wasn't a failure to act, yeah. So you get into these sort of debates over what does a rejection end up constituting?
Right.
And,
Yeah, what's your default rule? Sorry, what's your default rule at the end of the shot clock matters? But I was going to make basically let me just agree with you that it can be useful to have an on-the-record no. Presumably that requires reasons that can then be litigated, as opposed to the pocket veto, or maybe better term, the paper veto, where you do nothing for a while, because that can't be litigated.
Yeah, I'm noticing in this recent round of rules imposed on municipalities by the FCC for 5G infrastructure permitting that they have also a mechanism for fast-track litigation. And I don't know how the agency, you're the lawyers, you'll tell me how the agency is changing court enforcement on this. But anyway, there are federal rules coming down that also try to extend the shot clock to legal challenges. So certainly it would be interesting research to see, how these things are shaped and then how they're working in practice.
Yeah, I think that is the analogy that's most commonly drawn, and I think it's very helpful as long as a no isn't the end of the story, right? And which is what it's been in power transmission. So yes, you can get an answer, but all they need to do is say no.
right here in the, I guess, 5th row, and then in the 3rd row. I might be miscounting, I guess 4th row. It's right behind you, sir. Yep.
So it's a question to James. James, I think your hypothesis is that we have a set of projects proposed that would deliver a couple of goods to the public, economically in terms of lower prices, commercially in terms of increased business activity, and even ultimately environmentally. If we could wave a magic wand, imagine a world where NEPA cases were resolved in 2 years and that good projects move forward. How great is this good that is currently being deferred? And it's really a question of urgency and benefit. In other words, why is this important? How important is it? Is it a fraction of a % improvement? Is it Double-digit improvement? Over to you.
Well, so it is it's a massive improvement in several different ways. So, so for instance, in Texas, in the last 10 months, oil production has increased by 1.1 million barrels a day, right? As I said, there's never been a boom that quick anywhere in the world, even in Saudi Arabia in the 60s. So that is, think about, Texas, the U.S. is now producing 10 million barrels a day, right? So that is approximately $700 million every day. And you have situations in Canada where some of these problems have gotten really out of control. Their oil is being discounted. This has never happened in oil markets before, by about 60%. Right? So if you're losing, $400 million a day, that's that's a huge impact on the economy, right? So I think the impacts are it used to be people talked about how much does it cost to produce energy. That was the whole question. Oh, it's cheaper to produce in Saudi Arabia than here, et cetera. Now, because we're focusing on these cleaner products that are harder to transport, and we have these booms in gas and renewables, it's the whole game is how cheaply can you get it to market. Wind power and natural gas is often free at the well or at the wind turbine. And the only question is, can you transport it to consumers so that you benefit, producers getting something for their product, and the consumers have cheaper sources of power?
Why is it individual? Am I going to see this in my pocketbook?
Yes. So
Can you repeat the question?
Oh, so I'm sorry. The question was, will you see it as an individual consumer in your pocketbook? And absolutely you will. If you look at the electricity prices in places that have access to energy sources, typically between Pennsylvania and the Rockies, they're typically going to be substantially lower than places that are geographically isolated from energy transport.
Great. Last question?
Concept. In my own experience, nuclear power in this country has been a technological marvel and a political disaster. And I say that as a former nuclear submarine officer. The other is, and it may be apocryphal, that at one point Murphy's Law kicked in and a forest fire was started because the transmission lines between east and west were so overloaded by a dry, hot California that the power line sagged so low it caught fire. Any truth to that? And is anybody responding to that kind of thing when you stop permitting new transmission lines?
Let me,
Go ahead.
let me just quickly respond to your first comment. As someone who left Columbia, South Carolina this morning and overflew 2 big holes in the ground that are also holes in our state budget and economy, I can do nothing but agree with your statement that they are technological marvels but political disasters.
James?
Oh, and just on the California case is actually very interesting. So the where they started or allegedly started fires, these power lines, there has been they've been held strictly liable on the theory that they are government entities, and so. But I guess government entities without sovereign immunity, so they get the worst of being the government, but not the best.
Well, at least they have eminent domain, I guess.
That's right.
Eminent domain, it turns out, has a high price.
Well, anyway, thank you very much to all three of our experts.